Hi, this is Guy Burgess. For this post, I want to look at the distributional divide, which is a different aspect of the authoritarian populism problem and the larger political divide that is tearing apart so many democracies, including, and here's our focus, of course, the United States. Again, I want to start with a disclaimer that because of the polarized nature of the conflict and the strong feelings that folks have, a lot of, well, basically efforts to try to understand all sides of an issue will have you saying things that other sides sort of think is beyond the pale. And what I'd ask you to do for this is to try to empathetically look at the position of all the different parties in the distributional conflict that we're going to be talking about. Now, again, we want to talk about something that we call the purple-gold distributional divide. At one extreme, pretty obviously, are the folks with gold, that is, all of the money. The other end is the vast mass of the population, which includes both conservatives and liberals, which is why we refer to it as purple. We're also talking about fairness and not equality. One of the, I think, misnomers in popular discourse, we keep talking about the inequality problem. I don't think there are many people who really want total equality, but what you don't want is gross inequality and gross unfairness. And if we can fix some of that, we will have accomplished a great deal. When I've taught about this over the years, I've used this chart, which talks about the distribution of wealth in U.S. society. And it has three bars. The first one is they went around and did an opinion poll, and they asked people what the ideal distribution of wealth is. So on the left side of the bottom bar, that's the proportion of the wealth that the richest 20% folks thought ideally should get, which is a little over 30%. The next 20% would get correspondingly less, and the middle 20%. But as you can see, each of the groups got a reasonable chunk of the society's wealth. Then you ask people to estimate what they thought the distribution really was, not the ideal, but the estimated. And they say, well, yeah, the rich are really a lot richer, and they skew things over. The top is what the actual distribution is, and the bottom 40% have so little wealth, it doesn't even show up on the chart. And the richest 20% are pulling down something like 85% of the wealth in the society. And that sort of seems like this gross unfairness that we really need to address. And they went around and they asked the same sort of questions of different demographic groups. They're based on whether they voted for Republicans or Democrats, whether they're men or women, and how much money they made. And you'll note that they're not a whole lot much different. So there is a huge gap between the actual distribution of wealth in our society and what people think it ought to be. Another way to get at this, and this was a calculation I did a number of years ago, is I started with a simple observation that in 1979, the richest 1% of the society pulled down 7.4% of the society's income. By 2007, it had gone up to 16.7%. So in 2007 alone, this shift amounts to $1,116 billion, or $1.1 trillion. And just for comparison, these are some of the budget items. That's enough to fund basically the Department of Defense and Social Security, or maybe Social Security, Medicare, and pretty much everything else in the federal budget. This is an enormous amount of money to have transferred from folks who are pretty rich in 1979 to the folks who are a whole lot richer now. So what's happened since 2007? I found these charts that plot the increase in national income and the changes in percentages. So for 2014, the shift was again from 7.4% to only 12.4%. So in large part because of Obama-era changes in tax law and other changes, it went down to about $700 billion. from 1,100 billion dollars. That's still an awful lot of money. And to give you a sense of just how much money it is, the famous Obama stimulus package, which was 830 billion over 10 years, or roughly 83 billion a year, there was all this controversy. Well, this is like 8 times that every year. Then the question is, what is it going to be in the Trump era? And I couldn't find numbers about this yet. Well, there are lots of articles that suggest that the richest 1% are doing very well with the Trump tax cuts. There are also international comparisons, and this is how much more for various countries. And again, you can look at this online. The share of income went for, again, the 1%. And Russia is leading the pack with the United States second, but Britain and China and even Canada have enjoyed these same sorts of very large shifts in the distribution of income and wealth to the very rich. So look at it in other ways. This is a very provocative article, but up until up until around 1972, somewhere in there, 73, productivity and wages went up in tandem. And since then, as you can see, productivity continued to go up. That is, the amount of value created for each hour of labor. That went up, but the amount that actually was distributed in the form of hourly compensation, that's to wage earners, went flat. And that's one of the dynamics that led, again, to this enormous transfer or shift of wealth to the very, very rich. There are a lot of causes for this. It isn't just like the rich guys up and stole it. Another earlier post that we had tried to outline the complex causes of social problems. And as an example, it looked at the complex causes of the inequality or the inequity, economic inequity problem. And it wound up identifying all of these different things that contributed to the gross inequality that we see now. And I couldn't estimate how important each one of these are. That would be a really tricky study, but there are a lot of reasons for this. It isn't simple, and that we need to keep in mind. So we're trying to map this distributional conflict. So the image of just the rich versus the poor was a little bit too simplistic. I think you need to flesh things out. So I suggest, and at least as trying to keep things manageable, but still highlight the important differences, it's worth paying attention to the very, very rich, the 1%. And it is true that the 1% of the 1% did as well compared to the rest of the 1% as the 1% did compared to the rest of the society. So this chart on the right, the bottom line is how much income for the 1% went up since 1970. It's pretty flat. The top line is how much income went up for the 1% of the 1%. So you're talking about a very small number, 1,000th of the population that is pulling down such an enormous share of our wealth and income. Now, there are lots of reasons for this. Thomas Piketty has a very popular book out that talks about how capital in the 21st century and in prior periods was able to pull down such a huge share of the wealth. Kenneth Boulding has a similar explanation, or simpler explanation that still makes a lot of sense. That to whomsoever hath, to him shall be given, or he who's got all the money makes the rules in ways that can reinforce that wealth. You see this addressed in lots of different ways. Ayn Rand and book Atlas Shrugged, sort of all this competition and some people making out and others not. It's perfectly, that's the way society ought to be. And then you have Sarah Shays, who makes a pretty convincing argument that corruption is one of the principal threats to global security. Another window into this are articles like this that do a profile of Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And there's some pretty stunning statistics in this. Half of Amazon employees make less than $14 an hour. A third of Amazon employees in Arizona are on food stamps. The only way that a lot of Amazon employees can make it is because they get earned income tax credit, Medicare, and food stamps. And then you see things like this that strike me as pretty egregious. And this is an article argued that there are a whole lot of policy failures that led to this. Is that employees have to sign a non-compete agreement. So if you're stocking shelves for Amazon, you can't take a job working for Walmart for 18 months, which basically means you can't switch jobs, and Amazon can pay you whatever you want. And then this is the stunning one, is that he talks about all this wealth he's managed to accumulate. He's thought about philanthropic things, but the only thing that he can think of that's worth spending all that money on is space travel, rather than the welfare of the people who helped make him so rich. There are articles like this that talk about how having lots of wealth and power can affect the way you think. Here they use the phrase brain damage. It's a pretty persuasive argument. There are a certain amount of billionaire bashing of folks like Bernie Sanders, and creates the illusion that all of the rich guys are Republicans and not Democrats, which isn't really true. There are lots and lots of very rich, very progressive folks, and that raises questions too. The good news, and this goes back to some of these earlier charts, is that there was a time when the rich didn't pull down so much of society's resources. And if it existed in the past, then it must be possible in the future. We just need to figure out how to roll things back. So anyway, that's a lot of attention to the top 0.01%. And then there's the top 9.9%, sort of the next step down. And different folks define this in different ways. Some folks focus on the top 20%, the quintile. Some folks talk about it in terms of the meritocracy or the cosmopolitan elite. But the folks, these are the professionals at the upper echelons of society that are doing very well. This article talks about how they're the new aristocracy, that through a variety of dynamics, they have an increasingly solid lock on the top echelon positions within the social hierarchy. Charles Murray did this book a number of years ago, which really was the first that I'd read that alerted me to this split. And this was he just focused on white society, trying to filter out the effects of racism. This huge split that was emerging between the wealthy elite whites and everybody else. These are the left behind in the earlier chart that I talked about. This is another Thomas Edsel article, which is highly recommended, which has citations to an awful lot of other articles that are trying to understand what's special about this top chunk of the population. And not surprisingly, these guys are resented a lot by the rest of the society, and there's a huge gap in what they think about things. And here's again a lot of statistics, but you'll notice that the Democratic elite and the electorate at large have very, very different opinions on things. And that's part of the tension that's driving our society. And another group on this distributional divide is the protected classes. And you can go to Wikipedia and find the official list of official protected classes and the laws largely championed by Democrats that made them protected classes. And basically what you're trying to do here is to redress some of the terrible exploitation and oppression in history. I've already talked about the underside of history. This is one of the more terrifying graphics I've ever seen of the layout of a slave ship. But it isn't way back in those days. There's a lot of terrible things in the segregation era as well. So you have a large group of folks who have been exploited and oppressed. And so that forms another interest group. And that's different from the left behind group that the Republicans have been championing. And these are folks who sort of don't fall in the protected classes. In fact, the protected classes are supposed to be protected from these guys who, at least in the progressive way of looking at things, tend to be seen as heavily racist and sexist and discriminatory against all the other classes. And here you get windows. These are a couple of books that give a sense of how class separation within white society is getting to be an enormously big deal. And that also gives rise to a lot of tensions. You get a certain amount of backlash. This traces the shift of white men from, or I guess it's just men, democratic men, used to be much more democratic, and following the rise of the sort of feminist movement, and sort of not surprisingly seen their interest lying in the Republican Party and shifted accordingly. So you have this kind of backlash that also plays a role in determining who's fighting who over what. So the big conflict, and this goes back to those rather stunning statistics I showed you about the 0.01%. And if we're going to get the money that they've managed to acquire by whatever means over the last few decades back in a way that it can deal with a lot of the social problems that afflict the rest of the society. And in a certain sense, this is the at least one aspect of the authoritarian plutocratic populism. So the folks, the vast mass of the society are the populace, and the plutocrats with their authoritarian tendencies are the guys that are very, very rich. And so part of what we're trying to do is to figure out how you can basically pressure these guys to release some of the money in ways that have a more equitable society. Now that's not going to happen unless you can get some sort of peace between the protected classes and the left behind. And it's not going to happen unless the populist revolt can somehow form some sort of partnership with these professional elites who have such a dominant role in determining how society is run. So there's a need for peace building there. And there's also a need for peace building between the very rich and the rest of the society. There are a lot of very rich folks, Bill Gates comes to mind, who use their wealth to sort of advance the interests of the broader population. We need stronger appeals to do that sort of thing. And to the extent that the very rich can be persuaded to be more philanthropic, really, in a meaningful sense, is a big key to solving all of these problems.